So let's start. And if my panelists can turn on the video so that people can see us. Melissa is here, Tinaya is here, and Angela will be joining us. She's on the road. So today's webinar is about the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. Like that's the acronym that we will be using for the next hour or so. So AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol. Let me begin by saying that AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol is an important continental achievement, and the enthusiasm around it is very well deserved. I will be the host of this webinar, and I will be your moderator, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. So from here, when I look at the protocol, much of it feels very familiar. Its architecture draws heavily on the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, which is often presented in Washington as the gold standard for digital trade. And US technology companies and their allies have strongly supported that model because it works very well for American firms. That is why I come to this discussion with a simple question and a little bit of skepticism. How does this model work for Africa? What does the protocol enable for African markets, for African businesses, African consumers, and African policymakers? Where does the implementation need to be shaped so that the benefits are genuinely African? So these are the questions that we are going to discuss. But before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about Tech Trade Geopolitics Forum, which is the host of this agreement, and I'm the global coordinator of the forum. So the TTG forum brings together civil society, policy experts, advocates, working on the intersection of technology, trade, and geopolitics. Our aim is to make trade debates more accessible, connect them to a wider digital policy concerns, and strengthen civil society's capacity to engage in negotiations that often shape domestic policy behind closed doors. We share regular analysis through the TTG scan or Digital Trade and Technology Policy newsletter. You can subscribe to the newsletter and become a TTG insider. TTG Insiders offers deeper conversations, briefings, and opportunities for exchange across regions. We work in 4 regions: Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. Our work in Africa is led by Melissa, who has been central to building TTG's regional network and connecting digital trade debates with the priorities of African civil society. I will now pass the mic to Melissa to tell us more about TTG Africa's work and how today's webinar fits into it. Melissa, maybe a couple of sentences and then we start.
Sure. Thank you so much, Buju, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. I can see we have about 78 participants so far and growing. So TTG Africa, which is part of TTG Global, is really looking at how we can assist CSOs or digital rights organizations really understand how trade impacts their work. A really great example is what happened at RightsCon. We were all ready to show up at RightsCon, but did not. And we wondered what was the reason for the last minute cancellation. And if you've been a faithful member of GSCAN, then you've seen some of the arguments that have been made there as to how trade is actually part of the impact of the reason as to why RightsCon did not take place. It's just the tip of that. We've also been looking at the China heat trying to see what's going on in terms of geopolitics of China, ensuring that it is not only building infrastructure, also influencing policy moves quite differently from what we are used to, the Brussels effect. So actually is to make rights advocates aware of how trade impacts their work and how they can be more in tuned to assess trade agreements and what they can do to actually participate in that realm. We're not asking people to become trade experts. We're asking them to be more aware and to see the linkages between these two worlds. And this is especially true for us as we go into the negotiations for the renewal of AGOA, which is the African Growth Opportunities Act, which will definitely have impacts on the digital rights realm. So before I preempt what anybody else on the panel is going to say, I think I'll leave it at that. And we're looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for introducing TTJ Africa to the participant. And I see that we are like 79 people in the room. That's really great. And as I said, and I see some of the TTG insiders there. That's hi, TTG insiders. And many of our readers, TTG insiders, have heard about the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol in our newsletters. But we didn't really have a chance to unpack what it means in practice. So this panel will do that. But before we begin, I see that some of the participants are very active on the chat. So tell us in the chat, apart from introducing yourself, how familiar are you with the protocol? And tell me, very familiar, somewhat familiar, or completely new to it? Because I like to see I like to understand our audience and where you guys stand. And then I will have a follow-up questions, maybe after Tinaye's presentation. What is the first issue that comes to mind when you hear digital trade, data platforms, AI, cybersecurity competition, or something else? Because this will be an interactive conversation. I will ask you questions to our panelists, but I will also ask questions to you. So you will be like very active in this discussion, and we want this to be very interactive, very informative, and it's not very structured. So we won't have like 15 minutes presentations, but it will be more like our panelists like starting the conversation and we asking them questions. And the webinar is planned until 9 a.m. my time, 4 p.m. your time, but we may go 15 minutes longer if it works for all of the panelists and you guys. So, but let's try to be on time. That's why let's start with Tinaye. Tinaye, right? Am I pronouncing right?
Yes, Inaye.
Tinaye. So Tinaye is joining us from South Africa. Where are you based in South Africa, Tinaye?
I'm in Johannesburg.
Johannesburg. Okay, from Joburg. Hi, Tinaye. Okay, Tinaye is a trade lawyer, and he's the voice of trade on our panel. And he's an academic and executive dean of learning and teaching at EDEUS, South Africa. He brings more than 14 years of legal experience and deep expertise in international trade, business law, regulation, and corporate governance. And we are so happy to have you on our panel. So let us begin with the basics, Tinaye. What is the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, and where does it sit within wider AfCFTA framework? And what are governments committed under this protocol? So tell us a little bit about the protocol, its structure, and those like provisions in trade agreements. And which parts of the protocol matter most? Where should policymakers and civil society pay closest attention? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Buju. It's a pleasure and honor to be part of this platform. Effectively, maybe I'll just start by putting in a framework that this digital trade protocol is also an annexure to the main agreement, the AfCFTA, and effectively also has the same goal to bring together digital trade across many African countries. So there are quite a number of issues that were observed, and I'm very happy that this digital trade protocol also tried to look at the African context. So effectively, in trying to harmonize rules and principles that enable digital trade, it also enables the main agreement, which came about by a realization that there is more benefit, and there's also a lot of financial benefit in trading among African countries within the African market. So And inter-Africa trade history will tell us that this is something that has been there. But what I'm most happy about this agreement, it also speaks to the realities of Africa, aspects of inclusion, the digital divide, issues of infrastructure that may affect. So I think as already highlighted, it did not emanate from anywhere, even though others would say, it tried to look at the US-Mexico agreement, but I think the contextualization of Africa in itself. So effectively, the idea is to eliminate barriers to African digital trade. The protocol itself has 8 annexes, one relating to rules of origin, cross-border data protection, as well as financial technology and many, many other aspects. So what is also key is that this agreement this protocol also wants to push forward the objectives of the main agreement, which is AfCFTA. And maybe I'll categorize some of these key provisions. I think the first one relates to market access. So the idea is to eliminate any customs and provide a market access and also stop discrimination based on origin. So Article 7 of the protocol also speaks to that regarding that, and also provides a right to regulate. So even though within this agreement, each country also has a right to regulate and safeguard its public welfare, promote sustainable development. But however, even others have then said maybe this fragmentation. On one hand, this agreement provides that right to regulate. These are sovereign states that need to operate. But the issues come to that this agreement also wants to bring about this fragmentation, especially in issues of trade, privacy, governance, which are issues that are really coming up within the discourse, not only international trade, especially also privacy from a banking perspective. So, other aspects also that are really covered relate to the digital trade facilitation, data governance, business and consumer trust. So in most instances, trust within business is a key aspect, and not many, in as much as there is a growth, maybe from a fintech perspective, or financial technologies, but in most cases, consumers are not really trusting what is going to happen with their data, what if something goes wrong in the aspects of trade. So I think this digital trade protocol tries to bring all those together in really ensuring that there is a facilitation of trade within the African continent. So also a very important aspects that's dear to me is the aspects of digital trade inclusion. I think the agreement itself makes a deliberate attempt and also speaks to the realities of the African continent, that there is that divide. How are youth empowered? How are small business empowered? And also enhance getting access to markets. So the more these groups of people who may be excluded, them having access to a wider market will also really promote them in a greater scale, and also the promotion of skills and innovation, especially within emerging technologies. So some of these aspects are really key, and also a very pertinent aspect also relates to financial exclusion that and we've seen over the years that due to technology or some fintechs, they are now including those members of society who probably didn't have access to a bank account, but because of these fintech technologies, now they have access to that. So at least this agreement then tries to bring that platform and bringing rules together that ensure that all these objectives of really saying, how can we as Africa trade digitally? I think most of us, we are consumers within digital. But now the imagination is we should then be able to trade digitally without me having to travel to Nairobi, Kenya, but have transactions happening digitally. But the question is always around governance, what laws will apply in the case that there are issues, where does liability lie? How is data controlled within these different jurisdictions? So this trade protocol really tries to bring together all these fragmentation with rules relating to data protection, cyber security, consumer protection, fintech regulation. And I think research has shown that currently there is quite, even regionally, there are different rules that apply. And this agreement then comes to say, how do we bring this together? And I think it's for core that there are more benefits within the AfCFTA itself. Research has shown there are more benefits within having, trade within the African realm. But now with digital trade, I think it's something that's very phenomenal. And I think it's important that the implementation, if this is implemented well, then all the goals and aspirations of this digital trade protocol will be realized in that aspect. I don't know, Bunju, whether I should proceed.
No, this was great. I have a follow-up question because our audience is mixed. Some of them have like expertise. They have even written blogs about that. And some of them said we are learning, and some of them said we are very new. Some of them are very familiar. So we have a mixed audience, and I see that they are like on the chat. They are very active. This is really great, guys. Thank you very much for staying active in this discussion. So, but for the participants who are not familiar with the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, or for the ones who are very new to this discussion, if the audience remembers only 3 things about this protocol, what they should be, like just tell us 3 things, then I'll ask a few questions to Melissa, and then I'll come back after Melissa and Angela.
All right, maybe I'll say digital trade, innovation, cross-border digital services.
Okay, perfect. So Melissa doesn't need an introduction. She already introduced herself. She's our TTG Africa person, TTG Africa lead, but she's also the director of SUPIT, who is also kindly hosting this webinar. And it's pleasure to have Melissa here, and it's also a great pleasure for me to work with Melissa in the TTG forum. So, Melissa, Tinaya has explained the legal architecture, and I want you to bring this into the domestic policy space.
Okay.
How could the protocol shape digital policy choices African governments make? And which policy areas are most likely to be affected, whether that data governance, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, competition, or platform governance, or digital public infrastructure? I know that that's very popular in Africa now. And how could the protocol support regional cooperation? Because we keep hearing about the regional cooperation and regional integration. And where could it narrow domestic policy space? Because as lawyers, like when we talk about trade agreements, especially digital trade agreements, it's always a concern for us. So bring the conversation into the domestic policy space and tell us what this protocol does and aiming to do, and then we'll follow up with Angela, and then we'll talk about what can we do. So, okay, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pooja. I hope you can hear me. You can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yes. Perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So I really like the question, and I'm going to answer that question as part of my parting shot, because I have those 5 areas that I really think domestic policy is going to be or is currently being affected as countries ratify the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol that would be affected. And right now, I just want to walk through a few things. I think when we've already said that the protocol's architecture looks familiar to anyone who has read digital trade chapters from the USMCA or even the CPTPP. It's about free flow of data as the default rule, protection of source code as the default rule, with exceptions to be justified. Now, already free flow of data already touches on data governance and privacy and data protection, which is a big thing on the continent. And protection of source code touches on intellectual property policies, right? And because, as we like to say, none of these things work in a vacuum, we also will see effects on AI and emerging technologies, and of course, the big umbrella being trade. So for me, the key provision is Article 16 of the Annex on Cross-Border Data Transfers, which states that a party shall not restrict cross-border data transfers where the transfer is for the conduct of digital trade, full stop. And the Annex then defines restriction to include practically everything. Any prohibition, condition, restriction, or limitation, temporary or permanent, in a state's laws or regulations, even administrative practices or requirements. Now, this is worth pausing on. Defaults allocate the burden of justification, and this one places the burden squarely on the regulating state to show why it would want to restrict cross-border flows. Now, I want people to start thinking about the various jurisdictions in Africa and what the data protection laws are currently saying about cross-border data flows. And I also want to be honest, because I don't want to look like I'm bashing the trade protocol. I think that there's a valid critique, but the annexes of the protocol are not a photocopy of any Global North template. Even as Dr. Tinai mentioned, it's not really a photocopy of the USMCA, where USMCA-style chapters prohibit source code disclosure requirements almost entirely. The African text goes the other way in the annex. So Article 3 of the annex on the criteria for determining the legitimate and legal public interest reasons for disclosure of source code, and I'll read it. A regulatory body or judicial authority of a state party may, in accordance with Article 24 of the protocol, require a person or another state party to preserve and make available the source code of the software or an algorithm expressed in that source code, subject to safeguards and against unauthorized disclosure under the law or practice of a state party in order to pursue legitimate and legal public interest objectives. And it lists what those public interest objectives would be, including public order, safety, to protect human life or health, essential security interests. Security interest is a big thing on the continent, to protect and access critical infrastructure, etc., etc. So it seems that African negotiators took what can be argued to be important architecture from the protocol text, and in the annex, widened the regulatory doorway, so to speak. And the question I think we need to answer, if we can today, is whether domestic law is ready to walk through that wider door. And that depends on ratification and other issues. So in my view, the protocol assumes a regulatory floor that is still under development in many parts of Africa. Article 4 of the Data Transfers Annex requires every state to adopt or maintain a personal data protection legal framework, and crucially, that framework must comply with the principles and standards in Articles 5 to 14 of the Annex. And this effectively makes the protocol a continental data protection code hiding inside a trade agreement. Now, Article 5 requires foundational principles that are well known and probably already exist in data protection acts and frameworks across Africa. Lawfulness, fairness and transparency, data minimization, purpose limitation, storage limitation, accuracy, security, accountability, and confidentiality and integrity. Article 6 requires data subject rights and lists a few. Article 7 to 9 cover minimization in practice. Article 10 requires remedies and breach notification. Now, if we set this against the actual state of the continent, we have around 45 of the 54 African countries having data protection legislation, and roughly 39 having operational regulatory authorities. So the story is no longer about the absence of law. It was probably that maybe 5 years ago, but it is now about depth and harmonization. And none of the laws that are currently in existence were drafted with the Digital Trade Protocol in mind, because it's come after the enactment of these laws. And Article 25 of the Annex permits a state party to restrict transfers to another state party that does not maintain a compliant framework. So that it turns the protocol and its annexes into a compliance assessment that nobody has conducted yet, because we're going to go into seeing ratification. So we really now ask ourselves, for domestic policy, it becomes questions around enforcement capacity, questions around who is defining really what the domestic policy is saying, and not the enacted laws and regulations that exist, which have been informed by policies already in place in those national contexts. So there is sort of a dividing line with states that have statutes, but maybe have weak authorities, having to meet the need of compliance, or actually the requirement of compliance from the protocol. So we can see that Kenya is currently undergoing a process of revamping its digital data governance policy framework. We know that similar things are happening in Angola, Mauritius, Nigeria, and even Senegal. So the question is, these amendment processes, are they happening with the Digital Trade Protocol of the AfCFTA in mind? And are they aligned to it? And what then happens on the ground? So that's what I call sequencing failure, probably in one sentence. We also have AI strategies, and we really wonder how these types of instruments would answer questions on localization, transfers, algorithmic accountability, and how they could be preempted by the treaty text if we ratify without reconciling them. And if we're reconciling, what does that say again about national sovereignty? Okay, I feel like I'm talking too much. So I want to round off my arguments about domestication and really say that essentially the protocol requires 22 ratifications to enter into force, and we're waiting to see where those will come from. So I know that there was a digital trade forum in Lagos, which closed on the 2nd of July, which adopted 8 calls to action based on the protocol. So we are moving in terms of implementing it. So the text is finished, but the law is not domestically. Ratifications, compliance assessments, domestic alignment still needs to be done. And the annexes show us that the negotiators who are involved can sort of open the regulatory door a bit wider than what we've seen with other digital trade chapters around the world. But the question is whether the domestic policy and the constituencies behind those policies will be able to keep that door open. So that's where I'll leave it. And I do have the answer of the sectors as my parting shot.
Thank you, Melissa. I think it's very important to think about the annexes, because when I first started, I said that the protocol looks very familiar to me, because the protocol text is familiar. It's largely inspired by the USMCA, but the annexes, it sounds like the negotiators did a significant work with the annexes, and then they improved and they try to open up some of the provisions. So what is the how does it work, the protocol and annexes? So annexes provide, for our audience, especially for the ones who are not familiar with this structure, because AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol is a trade instrument. Can you explain it a bit? And one more follow-up question based on what you discussed, from a digital policy perspective, because this is something that many of us miss. We have digital policy, we have trade policy, they are siloed. But is it fair to say AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol is a trade instrument? Does it really capture its full significance for the digital policy, especially digital policy in African countries? And also, African governments are at very different stages of digital development. How will the protocol account for those differences? Because I mean, it's not very clear whether it's like something can work in Kenya, it can work in South Africa, but will that mean that it will work in, Senegal or Malawi? What's your thinking? I'm curious to hear about that.
Okay. Let me see if I'll remember all those questions because I got caught up with the last question. So the annexes essentially give life to what the articles in the protocol say, because the protocol is sort of meant to be a concise document. And this is not unique to the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, which is in itself sort of an annex of the AfCFTA trade agreement. So we are getting into the minutiae of protocols and annexes, and it's a whole melee of documents. But the farther you go down, the more context you're getting, the more information you're getting for implementation. So the annexes sort of give life to what the articles say. And that's why it's very interesting to me to see that the articles in the annex sort of widen or go further than what the protocol itself is saying, which I think is a good thing. So that's what the annexes does. Think about it as having an act of law, but you can also have regulations, right? You can have guidelines that are following through from the act of law, giving life to what the law is saying. For policy instruments, think about it as the enactment of now legal instruments to give the policy instrument life. That's how I understand and would explain what the annexes are and how they relate to the protocol. So if you want to get a full understanding, you should definitely read the annexes. But then there are plethora of annexes, right? So essentially, it's for people who are interested in certain areas to go and look at the annexes. So if you're really interested, you find the annex that makes sense for you in your work or your field of work, and you read it. Okay, now, is the Digital Trade Protocol a trade agreement? Is it something else? Technically, it's a trade agreement, technically, right? But looking at its nature, it really goes beyond a trade agreement. But it's not the only trade agreement that has done that, as we have seen through the years. And I can see Tinai coming back on, so maybe Tinai has something to say. I think it's really defining policies, right, through its text. The question is, should we be doing that via trade, or should that be done in a different forum? And where did this idea of utilizing trade agreements as a way of pushing through policy, where did it come from? I have several ideas, but I'm going to let Dr. Tinai say something about that.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. I actually wanted to answer the last question. But yeah, I think my view basically, I think because the whole intention was to promote trade, so I think it maybe made sense because trade also touches quite a number of aspects, from data protection, I mean, the financial technology. And those are, in as much as these may be distinct areas, one would then look at how, if it's then trade that affects maybe financial services, then probably that's the reason why they then had to have this protocol. Then maybe I'll move on to your last, the other question you asked to say, but was there any consideration of different levels of development? I think as I earlier on highlighted, I think this protocol really looked at the realities of the African continent, because if you look at some of the provisions, would really provide provisions for technical assistance, skills development, and also institutional strengthening. And also, it also really recognizing that countries have sophisticated regulatory authorities, while others have developing basic frameworks, for instance, in issues of cybersecurity, data protection, or even e-commerce regulation. And also maybe the preservation of regulatory space. I think some may see it as if that could be a barrier, but there are justifications or exceptions. I think Dr. Melissa also has strong arguments against that. But I think by having that preservation, that at the end of the day, there is sovereignty, there are issues of different strategies, maybe that may relate to financial inclusion, consumer protection, cybersecurity. So I think that's also the reason why I believe this protocol also really into consideration these different realities, or understanding that that there may be different levels of trade or development in all these aspects. But I think for them, then looking at even your startups, your small fintech, to say how are these also included, which are essential aspects of any African economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sinaya. So, Angela, have you reached to your destination?
Yes.
Are you with us? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Like now I'm gonna bring Angela into the conversation, because we talk about we discuss the legal rules, we discuss their policy effects, but I want to turn to Angela and discuss a little bit about the role of civil society and why civil society should care about this protocol. Like, I want to ask her, and you see her profile there, like on the screen, but let me introduce her. Like, she's a lawyer and digital rights and policy programs officer at Article 19 Eastern Africa. And her work focuses on freedom of expression, internet access, data protection, platform accountability, and the rights of African news publishers in the age of AI. So Angela is coming from a very different perspective. She's not Tinaya was our trade expert. I will still call Melissa as a trade expert. She's the trade and the digital policy expert, but Angela has a very different profile. She's the digital policy expert. And so now I want to ask her, why should civil society groups that do not normally work on trade care about this protocol? What's at stake for digital rights, human rights, surveillance, workers, consumers that are often absent from this trade discussion? And what are the practical entry points for civil society? Is it the national implementation, or African Union, or monitoring, advocacy, public education? Tell us, Angela, what has been your experience with this protocol, and how do you see this protocol, and where it will take us? And as part of the civil society, how we can engage with this protocol?
Thank you for your question, Buju. And maybe to set context, the word human rights does not appear in the AfCFTA protocol, and it appears once in the annexes, and that's it. So what you're going to see a lot more, though, when it comes to state power to regulate or to deviate from the articles in the main protocol, is legitimate interest, public interest. You're going to see commercial interest and cybersecurity. So those are seen to be the reasons why a state will derogate or act opposite of what that article is saying. So my concern really is for us to look at trade not just as a commercial aspect, but to look at trade as a place that can affect human rights in a very big way. And this should bring civil society on board. So civil society organizations were engaged, I think, when the AfCFTA, the main treaty, was being negotiated. And at the same time, the issues that civil society was raising was, we need more human rights protections in this trade treaty. We don't want us to replicate the existing inequalities when it comes to rights and things like that. And in Swahili, we have a saying, mgala mpe lakini haki mpe. Mgala muwe lakini haki mpe. So as much as there's so many negativities around the protocol itself, at least some of those issues were somehow covered. There's a talk of digital inclusion. We know why digital inclusion is important for Africa. We know that as much as we're consumers of technology, we're not consuming the technology equally. We know that we're still struggling with connectivity, internet access. This protocol talks about states' obligation to provide internet to consumers, of course, for trade purposes, but still it's talking about internet access. And again, we know that in this continent, internet shutdowns, internet interruptions are the order of the day, unfortunately, in certain jurisdictions like Ethiopia, and unfortunately, even in the countries that I work in Eastern Africa, it's becoming almost a norm. So it was interesting to see internet access get some form of visibility in this protocol. But really, my concerns is that we need to be a bit more intentional when it comes to protecting rights. Because big tech does not want rights to be very spelled out. They want rights to be hidden in things like human-centered approaches to technology, things like inclusion, very broad, general statements that don't carry any obligations for the state or the businesses themselves. But even at the international level, there is a level of human rights obligations for businesses. And that will mean that by default, trade treaties, trade protocols should have input from human rights CSOs and people who are going to be affected the most by how that protocol operates. So that is where the civil society should come in. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights were passed, or let me say they were, yes, passed and enforced in 2015. This protocol is being negotiated in 2020. We were expecting more visibility on the human rights obligations of businesses, especially given that digital businesses or tech companies' obligations are very wide given the reach of digitalization. And we didn't see that. The other concern that civil society has had for a long time when it comes to how digital policies are done in this continent is the fear that it's being influenced heavily by other parties, and other parties could be tech companies themselves. Sometimes it's regional trading blocs trying to influence Africa's digital policy. And we've seen this a lot in data policies, and we're also seeing this even now in this trade protocol. And this level of influence cannot be underlooked because they're going to set obligations, or it is setting obligations for states on how they're going to amend their laws, amend their policies at the national level. I'll give you an example. The protocol talks about electronic signatures and electronic contracts. This has already been ratified in my country, Kenya. We changed our Contracts Act to reflect it. So that's how influential these treaties and protocols are to how municipal laws are operating. And so what happens when you introduced normative frameworks at the regional level before domestic levels have tried to at least experiment or have tried to at least understand the needs of their countries when it comes to issues around data protection, competition, privacy? These are big themes, and I don't believe that there's a best practice or a best standard that needs to be given to all countries just because the US feels like this is the best model for digital trade rules. Let's just adopt them as they are. And this lack of imagination at a continental level is very worrying. Because we are yet to see an African approach to technology policy. What we are seeing is Africa co-opting the GDPR, Africa co-opting US trading positions on trade rules, and of course there's the e-commerce negotiations happening at the World Trade Organization that are still going to affect Africa. So what is Africa's role in all this other than passing or adopting what is said as the best standard or the best practice? That is very concerning for us. We saw this a lot with the data protection legislations that were being passed. And it's unfortunate that we're going to have the same experience when it comes to trade policy. What can civil society do? Civil society organizations are always asked to do so many things. So before I even start saying what civil society organizations need to do, I need to acknowledge that there's a funding crisis, there's a human capital crisis because some civil society organizations are not able to retain good talent and things like that. So as much as we're putting all these things for civil society to should, I would want to have a bit more awareness around what is the state of civil society as we speak in Africa at the moment. Civil societies are fighting to survive. They're fighting against a restrictive government. They're always reacting to different legislations at the municipal level. And this, of course, affects the level of participation you will see at the global level. You can imagine Kenya maybe has a budget for trade, the Ministry of Trade. They have sent the delegation. They have enough time to go through these treaties. Civil society, you are at the UN while still handling issues back at home and things like that. But that's notwithstanding, a good approach from civil society will be to negotiate at both levels, or at least to participate in both levels, because you might want to participate at the national level, but it might be too late. Maybe the obligation is too wide. So what do you do at that point? It will make sense to try and limit the influence of some of these protocols on the state obligations, so that we don't lose autonomy as countries at the behest or at the sacrifice for business efficacy, commercial ease, and things like that. And that is what these protocols want to do. They want to ease business. They want to make trade should be easier. But should these trade barriers look like giving away human rights protections? I'll end it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. And I see that like there are some questions, and audience, I have to say the audience is very active. I'm loving it. So I have questions too, but let's start with a question from Tanaka. And Tanaka asked us, like, how does the protocol balance promoting digital trade with protecting the regulatory autonomy of African states? And there is a follow-up question. Although the protocol is technology neutral, how well positioned is it to address challenges posed by artificial intelligence? While our panelists are answering these questions, audience, it's your turn. Put your questions on questions and answers, and I'll try to pick for you. Otherwise, I'll ask my questions, but I would prefer to ask your questions. So, like, who wants to go answer Tanaka's question?
Yes, I can answer Tanaka's question about the challenge. How does it address challenges posed by AI? Since AI is also one of the things that I'm passionately involved around. Let me specify African AI. So the protocol does actually talk about artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. It has a specific annex towards that. So there's an annex there. I don't know if Tanaka has read it. There's an AI governance and AI governance and the emerging technologies annex. Well, they call it the emerging and advanced technologies annex. So just go and look at it. It creates obligations on AI governance. And every state with a national AI strategy must now assess whether their domestic AI governance matches frameworks are consistent or matches up to the annex. And where national standards are stronger, then the protocol should not be used to water them down, is what I'm hoping. Where they're weaker, then the continental standard, which would be what is in the annex, must be then used to upgrade them, of course, with a 5-year window applying there. So it does talk about emerging technologies and AI, but it looks at it from a governance perspective. So again, we ask ourselves, why is a trade agreement talking about governance of emerging technologies and artificial intelligence rather than how we should be trading utilizing these technologies? And I think Tinai wants to answer the question about
I can see he's ready. He's like, yes, it's my turn now. Like, ladies first, but now it's your turn, Tinai.
Sorry, you say the question, sorry. No, something
okay. There's a question here. Tanaka asks, how does the protocol balance promoting digital trade with protecting the regulatory autonomy of African states? And I think you were touching on that when you were talking about sovereignty. Yeah.
Yes. No, certainly. Yeah, there is a balance. I think as I highlighted, some would criticize to say maybe there is too much autonomy. But obviously there are exceptions to how states or member states can still maintain their sovereignty aspects of data protection. But effectively, what the protocol tries to do is to try and harmonize that, but still recognizing that, countries, member states may have different laws and regulations regarding data protection, cyber and security. So I think the idea is to try and harmonize that through this protocol. And it's quite interesting to see how that will be realized from an implementation perspective. I think it's highlighted that in as much as there is that recognition that there are different levels, different laws um, across African states and how governance is being done, we really hope that there will be some clarity on how we realize that we have an African digital identity, as some say, within this particular digital protocol. So there is that recognition. I think like any international trade agreement, for instance, the WTO does make provisions, but in some aspects, member states can deviate from a particular provision in an attempt to protect not only sovereignty, but their plant, animal life, health, and all those aspects. So I think it does make that provision, even though there are exceptions that are there and where a justification has to be had. But I think as Dr. Melissa highlighted that, she's of the view that there is just so much part on the regulator to provide those justifications.
Great. And there's another question from Mustafa about the DPI, and I see that Melissa is like very eager to answer that question. So yeah, I know that it's an important topic for her. But I want to bring Angela into the conversation too, like and before we talk about the DPI, Angela, where do you see the greatest gap between the legal text, all the protocol and access? And you mentioned a bit, and the concerns of communities on the ground, the priorities like the of African digital policy community. Like, what are the silos?
I think the biggest hurdle that we're going to have to cross is making trade not sound like a commercial affair only, because there's a lot of laissez-faire from the civil society at large, because it's seen as a trade issue, it's an economics issue, it's not a human rights issue. And that already means that civil society participation is low. So I would first start from empowering civil society so that when civil society organizations are in the room together with economists and governments, we are all on the same page. We all understand the language. A lot is lost in language. A lot is lost in language, especially around limitations, legitimate interest, commercial interest, a lot of clawback clauses. What do they mean? And then the whole, at the end, the very biggest challenge that we have is that already our domestic laws are not pro-human rights. Some of them are not. So this just ends like creating a bigger problem for digital rights advocacy, if from my perspective, because you are talking about cybersecurity being a legitimate interest, and cybersecurity is already being used to infringe on human rights at the domestic level. This is what we've seen with fake laws, false news, public legislations that put a legal duty of truth, very invasive investigative procedures, for instance, in cybercrime laws, again giving the state a lot of power. So as civil society, we are not negotiating like business people. We are negotiating with the context in mind, understanding that this can work in Europe because they have very strong safeguards. It can work in the US. They have very strong constitution. They protect freedom of expression and things like that. So it can operate in that realm. But when you bring the same concepts, as good as they look on paper, the practice or the implementation is where we're going to see problems. I'll give you an example. We came with the data protection GDPR-like provisions across the continent, with exceptions on national security and things like that. The way those exceptions are being used by governments is to go beyond what a state should be doing in terms of national security or border control. So the same frameworks can look, that's why I'm very much against this call for best practice and gold standard, because best practice and gold standard, according to who, in which context, that is the problem we have. So having such an influential power like the US or influential figureheads like the tech companies themselves negotiating at that level, already there's an asymmetry of power between our governments and them. And we're going to still include it in our legislations at the national level, which is going to make it even a bigger problem for us. a lot of important things for Africa. For instance, consumer protection should be a big thing in this protocol, simply because we know we consume a lot. We're not necessarily producers or developers in the tech ecosystem, but you'll have a lot of provisions protecting our local companies, and it looks good on paper. But what we really need is a strong consumer protection framework, a strong competition framework to help us protect consumers. We are consumers. We need to legislate and make policies as consumers. So we should have consumer-centric trade protocols, especially for digital trade, for instance. But because we're being influenced by developers or countries that are heavy in development, we end up with protocols that look nice, but they don't really serve our purpose. So that is my only concern, that it's not serving us, it's serving another entity.
It's a very, very valid concern. And I have to say, even the word legitimate has lots of, I mean, in trade law, like when we say legitimate public policy measure, there are interpretations. So I'm also very skeptical of using the word legitimate, because in trade word it has its own meaning and interpretations. But that's a very valid concern, Angela. And I see that we are on time, but as I said in the beginning, I want to go a little bit like longer than what we planned, like maybe 10 minutes extra, because there are so many questions and there are so many people in the room. But I want to include the audience, and I have few audience questions for you guys. But while you are like answering those questions, and I want to hear from our audience, you heard from three panelists, three different perspectives, like coming from a different, different viewpoints. So let us pause there. And I'm asking you, which issue deserves the most scrutiny during implementation? Because now the implementation is a challenge. And in trade world, we say that negotiating a trade agreement is one story, implementing it is another story. So which issue deserves the most scrutiny during implementation of this agreement, this protocol? I'm asking you to put one word in the chat, and we'll discuss it while my panelists are replying your questions. So, and while our audience is thinking and putting a word in the chat, I want to come back to Melissa. I know that you're eager to answer the DPI question. And then I want to ask the audience, ask about the elephant in the room, China, because this is an Africa conversation. And we learn by experience, you can't avoid talking about China. Where do we put China? Where do we put China? Because when we did the China heat map with Melissa, something we came across was like Chinese approach is very different than American approach and European approach. Like Chinese Chinese approach to trade with African countries is more focusing on infrastructure, but also I have to say lately China started to sign this agreement, and they also go for regulatory coherence, and they want to provide the best like investment ecosystems for Chinese companies. So after the DPI question, and then there are some few like questions really connected to that DPI question, Melissa, like for instance, what is the greatest challenge to the effective implementation of the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, given the varying levels of digital infrastructure and regulatory readiness across African states? Melissa replies that question, and Tinaya and Angela, you think about China. I want to hear from you, and our audience. You put the word in the chat. Okay, Melissa, floor is yours.
Okay, I think that we need to really ask ourselves about the architecture of digital identity when we talk about DPI, because DPI cannot survive without digital identity architecture. And there is a digital identities annex to the protocol, which requires states to implement digital identity frameworks that enable cross-border recognition. And for my thinking here is that governments must choose whether they build on the Smart Africa SATA federated model, so open standards, interoperable, government controlled, or a private sector model which is convenient but creates dependencies and surveillance risks, or a hybrid? And this is where I think even China enters the chat, everybody else enters the chat, because who is building digital public infrastructure on the continent, or who has control of that? When you think about smart cities, who is that? If we think about the infrastructure for digital ID, who is providing that? So I also want us to remember something just above the Digital Trade Protocol, which is the AU Data Policy Framework, or what we like to call as the DPF, which recommends a federated open standard approach, I think. But it specifies that governments are not obliged to use specific technologies. So already that sets us off into the world of sovereignty. But without a positive decision from government, then the default will be whatever the market provides, which will most likely be a foreign platform. So I think what I'm trying to say is for DPI, we have to go further than the Digital Trade Protocol. We have to go further up and look at the DPF, because the DPF, I think, does a lot of data decolonization in its text. And I don't think it's sufficiently reflecting. But if we look at it as a whole and see the choices that we have, then we see that the pressure is at government level, and see how do we intervene at that level, which is why I think it's very important for CSOs to be part of this discussion, because they have the means, the ways through their advocacy, the networks that they have to really put pressure on government to make the right choices around digital ID, which is the foundation for DPI. And also the pathway currently of where everybody else is coming into this digital economy race in Africa.
Okay, now let's talk about China. And there's a question, so it's not only me curious about China, and the question is that how does the protocol address the likelihood of tech dependence on the continent by non-member suppliers? So Melissa mentioned a bit, Tinaya and Angela, what's your take on that?
Yes, I think certainly agree. I think the point on dependence, I think in as much as China has played quite a pivotal role, especially on infrastructure development. I think the question just comes into will they not be a dependence on all this infrastructure that's foreign, and also data protection being a very sensitive issue. Then would countries within the African context then allow their data being on platforms that they do not own? And I think it's something that even some advocates have then said, why don't we also, as Africa, also build some of this infrastructure and technology that will suit us as opposed to that over-reliance? So I think in as much as they've played a part, I think those are some of the concerns in my view, could be there. Then how do we move away from that over-dependence? And is that going to be sustainable in that context? Thank you.
Angela?
Yes, if I may be a bit radical, I think that the Chinese influence has a different PR from the Western influence. So the Chinese influence enjoyed a very good PR in Africa for a long time because they offered an alternative of what aid can look like. They showed that aid doesn't have to always be loans, right? So they were giving grants, they were building or upgrading conference facilities and things like that. And we really didn't know how it operates when it comes to what China wants. We knew it was beneficial to us, but we didn't know how it can be leveraged until RightsCon. So if you didn't know this, the conference center was in Zambia, Mulungushi Conference Center, was actually a grant. It was developed with a grant from the Chinese government. And then we started asking questions like, could this be the reason why suddenly the conference can't go on? Suddenly there are themes that need to be discussed further. Suddenly this is an election period and we don't want to have a very controversial meeting happening in the country right now. those are many ways to say that someone is not happy with this meeting continuing, and civil society was able to piece together and be like, yes, we're going to have Taiwanese participation in this meeting. We know how important Taiwan is to China. And knowingly or unknowingly, we were part of a bigger trade agreement negotiations going on, or a leverage being used finally. And we can't look at these grants the same way anymore. As civil society organizations, we cannot continue turning a blind eye to trade negotiations. We need to know the nature of these negotiations. In my country, Kenya, we have a big problem around disclosures of government and private contracts. And some of these private contracts are actually with Chinese companies with our government, and we yet sometimes even see the full contract itself. So it will mean civil society moving forward cannot be looking at trade like an outsider, or like just someone who is just seeing the being on the margins of trade negotiations, given that they affect how we exercise our civic rights, how we assemble, how we organize. It's a high time we take a bit more interest in what our governments are negotiating in. Another concern I have with China is the kind of technology that they are sharing with our governments. So again, as I've told you, the Chinese have a different approach to aid, which looks very hands-on, very benevolent. And sometimes African governments have asked for help from their Chinese counterparts in terms of surveillance technologies. And that is a concern for civil society because we are in the business of protecting rights, making sure that our governments don't go beyond what is the standard at international human rights level. So that for a digital rights CSO or a digital rights leaning CSO, that is something you need to look at very carefully because it's going to affect movement building and safety and security of human rights defenders and things like that. And finally, I saw a question in the chat around whether cross-border data flows can have an impact on safety and security of human rights defenders and activists. Absolutely. I think we cannot look at data protection equivalency simply because we belong to the same trade bloc. So we assume that all of us have the same level of protection to data. Again, African countries are at different levels of implementation of the data protection regimes. Yes, thank God, most of them now have acts of parliament, but before they didn't. And even then, the level of operationalization, having the office set up and things like that are different. And so just saying we want data to flow freely across the continent looks very innocent, looks very trade centric. But then you start thinking about what can this data look like? Can it mean that the information about a human rights activist in asylum in another country can end up in the wrong hands and end up putting them in jeopardy and things like that? So we need to think beyond trade and think about how these trade connections, trade rules can be leveraged to endanger human rights.
Thank you, Angela. I think that was a very good point to make. And I asked the audience which issue deserves the most scrutiny during the implementation, and I asked them to put one word in the chat. I haven't received any answer to that question. So I think that can be a good concluding a question for our panel. So since the audience the audience didn't reply, so I'm going to ask the question, that question to our panelists, Tinaya, Melissa, and Angela. And I will also ask you to make your concluding remarks because I see that we are really like going to 9:15, 4:15 now. So, and Melissa, and after that, I want you to connect this AfCFTA to our work in the TTG and our future plans and future webinars. So let's start with Tinaya. Which issue deserves the most scrutiny during implementation? Tinaya, what do you think? What's your expert opinion? I think you are muted.
No, thank you very much. I think I share sentiments, I think, from a rights issue, especially digital right issue, cyber security and protection. I think I would agree with Angela that, yes, it's not really explicit in terms of what other human rights do affect this trade protocol. But I think it's something that's would be quite interesting to see in terms of implementation, data protection, and I think also consumer rights. I think one of our guests also spoke about that issue to say, I think consumer rights should really be at the forefront. I think most African states are starting to realize that consumer protection is a key issue, especially in the context of digital trade.
Thank you. Melissa?
I have two questions, and I'm going to leave the first question because I would say everything, affecting everything. We need to address everything, and also the lawyer answer is that it depends on which field we're talking about, how we're talking about it. So I'm going to leave that open. I'm so sorry. I'll be a lawyer and say that. The second question is, what does this mean for TTGA forum? I think this is the first.
Wait, like. Let Angela replies, and then I'll come back to you to conclude with and tell our audience about our future plans. Angela.
For me, two issues. I've said this earlier: consumer protection, because we're mostly consuming technology from other places, and competition. I think we are yet to really see a harmonized framework on competition at the continental level and even in the states themselves. Countries are yet to really regulate digital markets, and this is leaving consumers at a very bad place. I say this because consumer protection and competition are almost twins or cousins at that point. And if we don't try to make sure that power asymmetries in trade, especially in digital trade, are addressed, and making sure that we don't have dominant market players taking advantage, and they're taking advantage of many things. It's not just a consumer who's not aware, but also a government that doesn't even have the framework to put them to order. It's chaotic, it's fragmented, and that is exactly what big tech thrives on. So we should focus on competition and consumer protection beyond the annexes, beyond the protocols, and ask states to truly do better when it comes to protecting the African consumer.
I think that's a really great great approach, and that's something we need to ask. And unfortunately, trade negotiators, when they are negotiating these agreements, they don't necessarily think about consumer protection or competition or AI regulation. At the end of the day, I always tell people, trade negotiators negotiate trade agreements. So it's our job to make them aware of all our concerns and all of our issues and educate them. And with AfCFTA, maybe we are a little bit late, but as I said in the beginning, negotiating a trade agreement is one story, implementing it is another story. And it was really great to have you discussing the AfCFTA and its implementation here with us. So I want to thank to our panelists, but I also want to thank to our audience because I really felt the excitement and momentum in the room. I mean, I say room like we are all online, and we received many questions, really great questions. Sorry, we couldn't answer all of them, but we will do a write-up and we will probably talk about this webinar in our TTG scan next upcoming TTG scan. Please subscribe, but the subscription is free, but all the subscription request needs to be approved by the TTG firm. So please use your organizational affiliation and your professional email. And I'll end it here and pass the mic to Melissa, and she can tell us a little bit more about TTG Africa plans and what's coming next.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you so much to our panelists, especially Angie, who is joining us all the way from Lagos. Angie is not usually based in Lagos, so thank you for joining us from there. So what's next? This is the first webinar of a series of webinars where we're essentially looking at the current bubbling topics around trade in Africa that touch on digital rights. So today we've looked at the AfCFTA, and we are heading towards AGOA because AGOA will be renegotiated in December. It has had a one-year extension, and now we are wondering, all these insights that we have for the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol after the fact, what can we say about AGOA before it's finalized for the next extension? And essentially, we will be sharing more on the newsletter, but the next 2 webinars will be on AGOA. The final one, the final webinar in the series has very interesting panelists, and we will be really talking about so many interesting topics, especially about what type of trade is going on. Even as we're talking about digital trade, what exactly are you trading? What services are being traded? And I know that that's a wonderful or exciting conversation to have in this particular is it era that we're in? Yes. So thank you so much. We have 87 people at the end. We had hit a high of about 100 and something participants. So thank you for all of you for joining us. Thank you, Burju, for being such a wonderful moderator. There was a question for you in the chat, but we will answer that question in the next webinar series. Thank you to Christine and Catriona, who have been behind the scenes, making sure that we do not go offline, and who helped us prepare for this webinar as well by sending all the emails and ensuring everybody was registered. So as we say in Kenya, asante sana, kuwa na siku njema. If you have anything to say to us, you can send us, contact us or connect with us according to, I don't know where Christine took the last slide from. You can scan that last slide and you can connect with us, but please remember to register for the TTG scan. And asante sana and have a good afternoon. Bye.